Eric Newstadt will be speaking on Bootstraps 101.
Thanks very much. I have to admit I was more than a little bit crestfallen when, I think after writing the outline for this talk, I saw James and Alan's piece on Austerity U, which seemed to crib exactly from the ideas I had yet to articulate to anyone almost. And then I was even more crestfallen when I saw that they were ahead of me on the So I might, if we've been running a little bit late, be able to make up some time by kind of saying what they said.
We're not running late, Eric, so we have lots of time.
To the extent that I have a bone to pick, and I do a little bit, I want to deepen in some ways the outstanding analysis that Alan and James have provided of entrepreneurialism by discussing the various ways in which entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial learning and entrepreneurialism in the university is not in fact so new. And as much as it does signal a sea change, I think that sea change is about the consolidation of a trend that's been happening in and around Ontario universities for going on 30 years now. In fact, what struck me as remarkable about the recent incarnations of entrepreneurship in Ontario universities was that they were somehow different from the kind of entrepreneurial learning that students ostensibly have come to take from all of the programs in the university. In other words, I think where once entrepreneurial programs might have been described for students as something starkly different from what they would learn in political science or sociology, today it's necessary to describe for students entrepreneurship so that they can distinguish it from the entrepreneurial learning they do in political science and sociology and anthropology, etc., etc. In fact, I think, again, the history of entrepreneurship in Ontario is quite long. Now, as James noted, you can break the spine of almost any government report and find that they immediately start talking about the needs to create new young innovators, young entrepreneurs. Sheldon Levy has traveled across the country at one point as the chair of the COU, preaching for the need to focus on Canada's young innovators. And so there is indeed this drive to create what are in some ways very circumscribed programs around entrepreneurship. That said, when you look at the language that is used in those reports, and I'm going to quote from, in fact, the same section that James quoted from the COU, it's rather slippery when it comes, and imprecise when it comes to the proper remit of entrepreneurialism in the university. From that COU report that James mentioned earlier, there are entire programs devoted to teaching students what it takes to invent the next big thing, attract investors, and take their service or product to market. Universities are now preparing students to create their own jobs as well as jobs for other people. So from the specific, almost immediately, the report moves to a more universal description of the remit of entrepreneurialism. And though government bureaucrats and policy wonks have been at pains to, in talking about the government's recent program of differentiation, talk about the fact that entrepreneurship will be taught in specific programs, the discourse around differentiation is itself utterly polluted with allusions to entrepreneurial forms of behavior. From the Liberal government's arm's length shill, the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, we find, quote, differentiation promotes institutional quality and system competitiveness by enabling each post-secondary institution to grow preferentially in those areas where it already excels or aspires to excel. Higher quality programs means that the credentials students receive upon graduation are more highly valued. This makes the students more competitive relative to those from other jurisdictions and makes Ontario universities more attractive to international students. What we find, I think, is that there are two operative definitions of entrepreneurialism operating in and around the mainstream discourse. One refers to a specific and very circumscribed set of skills, those dealing with human resources management or financial accounting or marketing concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And then a much more universal and extensive notion of entrepreneurship around issues of self-help, a tolerance for risk. In fact, the understanding that risk and failure are in fact useful in your career as a worker or an entrepreneur. So what I wanted to do is just illustrate the degree to which this much more extensive definition of entrepreneurialism not only hovers around any mainstream use of the more circumscribed definition. I wanted to draw out some of its theoretical roots, which are, in fact, the very roots of neoliberal theology. They come from the 1940s and the 1950s. Critically, one of the first ingredients was Hayek's redefinition in 1945 of the central problematic of economics. For neoclassical economists, until Hayek, the problem of scarcity was met through simple supply and demand, interaction in a marketplace. When Hayek came along, he made the definition of the central problematic of economics not just about scarcity, but about how to appropriately allocate resources given scarcity. And he said that the only effective means to do this was through the power and force of the market. The market could operate as a kind of supercomputer, able to sift through the knowledge that was available in this marketplace of ideas as he conceived of it. And it would, with proper support from the state, help to construct a particular kind of social order. So that was one of the key ingredients, this idea that anything other than the market was, as Hayek famously put it, a fatal conceit. The second theoretical foundation for the extension and universalization of entrepreneurialism came through the Neoliberals' reconciliation with monopoly. In fact, right up until the late 1940s, none other than Milton Friedman was an avowed opponent of monopoly and oligopoly. This might strike some of you as unbelievable because he became such a champion of monopoly and oligopoly. He became such an opponent where he had once been a strong proponent of antitrust legislation. In fact, with generous funding from the Volcker Foundation, the neoliberals, Milton Friedman, Arthur Director, and others at Chicago, engineered a theoretical workaround for monopoly and oligopoly that in effect simply ignored it and thereby made market structure irrelevant. And what this in fact then did was made everybody conceivably entrepreneurial, right? Now everybody was subject to forces of competition, even the largest agglomerations of wealth. The third theoretical component that I think inspired the subsequent universalization of entrepreneurialism came from Entrepreneurship Studies. It was a discipline that was famously institutionalized at Harvard's Center for the Research in Entrepreneurship, and where, until that point, entrepreneurship had been the study of business history concerned most poignantly with the decision-making capacities of key and famous and historically important business leaders within the context of their firms. What happened at Harvard was that entrepreneurialism was emancipated from the fetters of the corporation, effectively. It became a study of the universal principles of decision-making and risk-taking that we now commonly associate with entrepreneurialism. With that theoretical foundation, that theoretical stage set, by the 1980s, as David Harvey has described, we saw en masse, the move from managerialism, as he put it, to entrepreneurialism in terms of forms of state management. This was the moment when municipalities around the world, even those that were staunchly against the revanchist policies of Thatcher and Reagan, began to define policy in terms of entrepreneurship and the need to be hyper-competitive municipalities in an increasingly global marketplace. So they could do more progressive things with the money that they received. They could build transit, but they would build it so that they could outcompete other municipalities in this global marketplace. They were going to be entrepreneurial municipalities. That description, of course, is apt for the university too. This was famously capped off by Burton Clark with his book, The Entrepreneurial University, which he actually wrote as a how-to for university administrators avoid the pitfalls of the neoliberal university. Ironically, he became quite an opponent of the way in which that book was ultimately used. So in 1980, this kind of entrepreneurialism is enshrined famously with Bayh-Dole and various hooks that are designed to encourage researchers in the natural sciences increasingly to explore and develop monopolizable, patentable forms of research that they can, as Jamie usefully pointed out, continue to take a stake in without there being any noticeable or charged conflict of interest. So in fact, what we see is the natural sciences, and now this is entered increasingly the mainstream discourse, this idea that the natural sciences have been subject to pressures of commercialization. What I wanted to point out is that the social sciences have been subject to many of the same pressures, particularly, although by no means exclusively in Ontario. The precipitous rise of tuition fees in this province began in the early 1990s, when Bob Rae eliminated upfront grants and started raising tuition fees, continued to this day. The Ontario Centres for Excellence, which inspired subsequently the National Research Centres for Excellence program, started in 1980. Students were encouraged via a whole new discourse to understand their university education as a kind of investment vehicle that would generate future anticipated returns. So this encouraged entrepreneurial forms of behavior, as did the competition for bums in seats. The growth and the massification of the university saw university administrators pressure departments to compete for student bodies and resources. So department chairs became increasingly entrepreneurial, and they were encouraged to do so. In the process, what happened was, and James and Alan mentioned this, we saw a transition in the social sciences. So the normative shift that we, even increasingly in the mainstream, account for in terms of the commercialization of the natural sciences, the analog in the social sciences, I would suggest, is the emergence of instrumentalized, or what Robert Cox famously described as problem-solving forms of theory. So we see in the social sciences an abandonment of critical forms of thought. Canada's rich tradition of political economy becomes severed, and space for critical thought shrinks, and a turn increasingly to very instrumentalized forms of knowledge that in fact reflect both what students are looking for, what administrators are pressing for, and what faculty are experiencing outside of the classroom. Faculty are, of course, hardly insulated from processes of globalization and the neoliberalization of the political economy en masse. And to the extent that in their everyday lives they were conducting various calcula that encouraged entrepreneurialism, which interest rate will I go with for my mortgage, et cetera, the everyday manifestations of global finance, as some people have referred to them, were things that faculty were hardly immune to, such that we see increasingly the ascendancy and hegemony of, in various disciplines, traditional disciplines, problem solving and instrumental forms of thought. That said, we need not necessarily consider the transformation of the traditional disciplines in light of the fact that since 2011, of the 146 programs that have been approved for teaching in Ontario's universities, fully 107 are of an obviously applied bent. So to the extent that encroachment and closure hasn't happened in the traditional social sciences, it's happening by other means. So what I think, in effect, entrepreneurialism and circumscribed programs of entrepreneurship signal is, again, this process of consolidation whereby these circumscribed programs will operate in every university as a kind of pole of adjustment around which every program will need to be articulated. To the extent that incubators are available to every student in every department, regardless of their programmatic focus, they are things that students will want to be able to access with the skills that they are taught in their programmatic areas. And I think that will force faculty to adjust, as will the need to compete for spaces and appeal to students and provide students with the kind of education that they're looking for. And of course, there are other obvious confounders here. The pressure to publish is only intensifying as the academic market becomes tighter still, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess what I wanted to point to is the degree to which this entrepreneurship, again, is about consolidating a program that has rather deep roots in the province, and thereby suggest that the kinds of strategies we need in order to push back against this trend need to go beyond the classroom. They need certainly to, as Alan and James I think have usefully pointed out, involve anti-colonial forms of curricular redesign, but they also, and I think just and perhaps more importantly, need to go very far beyond the classroom and in fact beyond the university. And here I would just point to some of the things that Jim Turk was talking about at the outset here, the need for faculty to actually leverage their academic freedom in support of labor and working people more generally. I guess I'll stop there. We can talk more about strategies perhaps later.